Hi everyone, it's Kevin here again, and this week is week 4, so we're going to be going over a couple new items here. This is the application that we'll be building. Well, at least in this lecture video, the assignment will be slightly different. So what we're going to start off with is going over this functionality and what the app does and what we're going to cover. So this is basically just a tax calculation app. So the way that I calculate taxes in this app, the logic is not up to standard, right? It's not actually what the government uses, at least in the United States, to calculate taxes. Excuse me. So, at least with the functionality of the app, all that this does is it takes in some income, and you define whether you're single or married. You enter your state, and based on that, you get taxes due. So that's your tax liability. Notice the formatting of the decimal. That's also relevant. So, what's wrong with the app? What's wrong? Why can't it be up to up to standards? The reason is because of complexity. So the way that taxes are calculated is not like this. So the way that I handle the logic here is I created this here class. This tax model has a couple variables that we use throughout the model, and I have this method to calculate taxes. What this method does is it based on the income that you pass in, or based on the income that's set in this class, it calculates the taxes due, the state and the federal taxes due. So notice it also depends on whether or not the individual is married, but the problem is that with the calculation here, I just set the tax rate to just some percentage, right? So say you're married and you make and you make less than $20,000, well then your tax rate is going to be 10%. If you make between $20,000 and $80,000, I know that this might look a little off. Just for the purpose of the application, it's still demonstrates the conditionals and all the other stuff. So basically, notice how it just sets a single percentage. So if you make $171,000 to $326,000 as a couple, 24%. This isn't how it's actually done. So the way that it's actually done is and these aren't the real numbers from the IRS as well for 2023, 2024, whatever. These are just arbitrary numbers, arbitrary brackets. They might look similar, but they are not the exact brackets. So the way it would actually work is say you're single and you make $65,000, just for a random number. And at $65,000, what would happen is from $0 to $10,000, you'd pay, in this bracket system, you'd pay 10% from 0 to 10,000. So 10% of basically $10,000. That's what your liability would be for that bracket. So let's just pretend we have a stack, right? A stack of numbers, and that goes at the bottom of the stack. Then we would go from 10,000 to 40,000. Well, then that amount, right, that $30,000 there, and I know again might not be exact, right, because of the way that I handle the logic, but $30,000 for the purpose of the application is going to be taxed at 12%. And then from 40,000 to 65,000, that amount is going to be taxed at 22%. Each one of those numbers gets added to the stack. The sum is what you're going to owe. I know it's a little bit complicated, or to others it might not be complicated at all. But what matters is that this isn't the exact way that it's calculated, so just wanted to make everyone aware. If you did want to handle it that way, I did write the app to do it that way, and honestly it ended up being too complex. It ended up being a little bit too much for the purpose of the app. So what I ended up doing is I just had a map of type double and bool. So basically we had the double, which was the key, which was the tax rate, and then bool was the whether or not the bracket was active. And based on that, I set that throughout here. Then I looped through it, and depending on the brackets that were active, I had a method that went and calculated the taxes due for that bracket. Again, too complicated, so I dropped that. With the state, I did something similar, although there's no income limit or income brackets with the state tax. Basically, if you live in Minnesota, you pay 6.875%. If you live in Wisconsin, you pay 5%, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's the basics of the application. What are we going to cover though? We're going to cover. So last week we covered text widgets. We covered a little bit of setting the state and handling buttons. This week we're going to use a lot of the same structures and actually think about it as math. So in Algebra 1 or your equivalent class, you covered functions, right? Something takes an input, it provides an output. You covered a little bit of the Cartesian plane by that point. Coordinates, so on and so forth, and then it just builds on that, right? Algebra 2 uses the same concepts from Algebra 1. You're going to use this. The arithmetic doesn't change. It's going to be the same. So it's the exact same thing here. Once you learn a certain concept or a certain piece of logic or way to handle something, right, problem-solving method, it's going to be in your toolbox so that you can use that to solve problems in the future. So you can use that text widget in the future. You're going to keep using that. That's going to be used a lot. So with that being said, we're also going to cover scaffolds. We're going to cover snack bars. We're going to cover a little bit of object-oriented programming in a mobile application using Flutter. We're going to cover using lists within your application and actually showing that data. We're going to cover controllers, so text editing controller in this case, and that's the way that we're going to be able to get our value. So say we have here, good way to find something, Control F it. So income, right there, it's defined. So our text field, that's connected to a controller, and that controller is what we're going to be referencing to get that value, right? Controller.text. Why it's done that way? That's the way Flutter is basically, and other programming languages and other frameworks, and I shouldn't say programming languages because that's not really appropriate in this context. In other frameworks, you might access the element directly. So in Angular, you might bind it to a value. In React, you might also bind. Yeah, binding is huge, right? We're not going to do any binding here. We might cover it later on in the course because it does show up in a lot of different frameworks like Maui and Xamarin, React and Angular. But anyways, you're going to be referring to that element via some method, right? Or not method as in function, right? There's going to be some way that you're going to access the value, and in this case, that's how the controller is used. The controller is used to access that value. So we're going to go over keyboards, a little bit of spacing. With all that being said, though, why don't we get started? Move this over here, and we're going to create a new project. This might be a slightly longer lecture, just because of the amount of material that we're going to be covering, just so that you're aware. So I'm going to go into my Week 4 folder here for all of the class stuff. Then create a new folder in here. Call it Week 4 lecture. We're going to go ahead and create a new project in here. I'd rather have get bash, but whatever. It should still work because it's in the environment variables. So we're going to go ahead and create that. With Flutter Upgrade, it is a good idea to upgrade whenever you can. That way you can have the latest functionality. However, I will give a little tip here. So whether you're working in Angular or Xamarin or Maui or any framework, and you get an option to update a library or a bunch of libraries or the entire SDK, the software development kit, always be mindful of functionality that might break. So for example, at one point I ran into a problem where I wrote some logic to draw some items on screen, and that referenced a certain element or control, and that control ended up being broken by an update that I made. So I came up with a workaround, and eventually they patched it. But the point is, just keep that in mind. You got to have methods to roll your changes back, and immediately Git comes to mind. We haven't covered that yet. We will cover it, and we will use it extensively because of how powerful it is. But that's just something to keep in mind if you want to upgrade something, or say you're working in the future on a personal project. You let it sit for a few months, a few years, even, and you go and update it, you might have stuff that doesn't work. That's happened to me with Flutter already. With this here message, by the way, you can go into settings. There's a Stack Overflow post on it, but you can go into settings and you can set the amount of background tasks that you allow to run. It shows up when you're debugging quite a bit, just so that you're not alarmed. So now that we created this, we're going to go ahead, open it up, open this with code. I'm going to move this over here and we're going to go ahead and get started now. So what do we want to start off with? Well, we're going to want to start off with some of these items that you see here on screen. So the visual elements. We're going to move on to the logic later on, but let's start off with getting our visual elements drawn. So I will have the, just to speed up the development process, I will have the other one in another window just so that you all are aware. But we're going to be going through the logic anyways. So in this case, it's all the logic's going to be in the main.dart file. So if we go to lib, open up main.dart, we're going to see all of the boilerplate code, all the stuff that gets created when you create a new application. And one second. I'm going to keep getting rid of these items here. Now what you can do is you can do this and then get rid of all the stuff that you need to get rid of and save it, and then you can use that for future projects. That's an option. Something else that is quite useful is auto formatting. So for example, if we get rid of this, well, that's not going to work, but let's think of, if we save that. So if I set this down here and then I save, it'll automatically update it. That's something that you can set in your settings or configuration, basically. So what are we going to start off with? Well, why don't we run the app to see what exactly it's doing. So make a mental note of what this here looks like, and we're gonna see what it's going to change to. I'm going to go ahead and debug, just because I like to debug. And this week I can also go over debugging a little bit as well, rather than having like a separate thing on that. Reason being, by the way, for debugging is it's so much easier to find bugs in the program. It's so much easier to find where the logic is not working perfectly, because you can see the values as you're going through the program or running through the method or through whatever logic. So we're going to let this here compile and deploy. I'm going to go ahead and pause until that gets done. So that took a little bit longer than expected. Might take a few minutes for you as well, just so that you're aware it can take a little bit if you want to debug. Remember that when you're debugging, you're attaching the state of the application to the debugger. So it's quite a bit of overhead. So if we look here, looks like it's the boilerplate application. We hit this, it fires off a set state, and it goes and updates that text on the page. So what we're going to start off with is, why don't we start off with renaming it. So if we go up to the top here, Flutter demo homepage, we don't want that. Let's do week 4 lecture. And instead of week 4 lecture, actually, why don't we make it a little bit more appropriate? Week 4 tax calculation. Calculator instead. Tor? Whatever. Not an English teacher. So once we do that, the title, not super relevant here because it's not displayed. It does have its purpose, right? If we look here, we'll see we can look at the documentation. It'll tell us where it can be displayed, but for now, I'm not really going to worry about it. The colors, you can have it be purple. You can have it be whatever you want, honestly. Change that to whatever you want it to be. Instead, why don't I just have it be, I don't know, green. User tooling. So if you misspell something, tab. So look at that. G. Not correct. Just hit tab. Updates it. That's pretty good. Now that we have that done, we have our scaffold. This is very important in the application. Of course, it's necessary, at least for the main page. So we're going to want to keep that. The app bar, we're also going to want to keep. The center, we might do away with that. And let's see here. Actually, no, we're going to keep it. The column we will be doing away with. So why don't we start off with getting rid of some of this here alignment stuff. I think I missed. Okay, there we go. So that's good. So we're also going to get rid of this floating action button because we're not going to need it. We're going to save that. It's going to automatically format, so that looks pretty good. We're going to want some padding because if we don't have the padding, it's going to hit the edges of the screen. We don't want that. That doesn't look good. Some of you might look into doing UI. Some of you might look into doing back-end stuff. Regardless of what you end up doing, if you're in a not a cross-platform, but if you're in a quote-unquote full-stack area, you're going to want to be able to at least halfway do stuff. So if you're going to have something that you got to present, like a proof of concept, you might as well look into having it be halfway decent. So gradients are pretty big. Gradients are a lot more pleasing for the user. Don't just use, like, this even goes with like HTML or any sort of web application. Like, does it really take that much to create some CSS? And honestly, even forget about the CSS. Just use some Bootstrap or use any sort of UI library. But it's nice to have things look halfway decent. And I don't like UI personally, but it's good to have. So we have our center. We're going to wrap this with some padding. So we could actually do this here. We click on this. We right click. And we select refactor. We wrap this with padding. And there we go. So you might get this message, by the way, like const, and I may have already gone over this. You can add it. I mean, it is proper. You're supposed to add constant. I guess it's up to you. It'll still compile. I'm not going to really worry about it too much. But if you do want to get rid of it, you can. There's also, let's see if it shows you here. It doesn't show you here, but you can go in the top of the document. You can go in your YAML. So I believe it's your pubspec.yaml. You can set it in there. It's one of those files where it's going to ignore that always, so that it never gives you this. Gosh, where's the editor? There's an editor, typically an editor, like warning or error assigned to each one of these things. So you can go and set that manually. Our padding is going to be 8 pixels around everything. And we're going to have a column here. So this column, we're going to align it. So main axis alignment, cross axis alignment. In this case, we're going to use main axis alignment. And we want it to be at the beginning. So we're going to want it to start. If you think about a big old cross, main axis alignment, to be near the top. Think about how a column works too. Think about like a Roman column, right, from top to bottom. So make main axis alignment dot start. That looks good. Children. Now I will make everyone aware now. As I'm writing this here logic, we may run into a problem where stuff's not perfectly lined up. If I run into that, I'll just pause. I'll clean it up, and we'll get back into it so that you guys don't have to suffer through it. If you're watching me find the missing trailing comma. If you run into it, you could go and Control Z, so that's one option. You can Control Z until it works again and then go start over, or you could just look for that trailing comma. So it's type widget here. What we're going to do here is we're going to have a text widget. Yeah, I'm not going to make you guys sit there and watch me type these things. There we go. And we see that shows up at the top of the screen. However, notice how it's tiny. That's not super, it doesn't look good. So far, it does not look good. So what we can do is we can add a style. And we're going to have a text style. That's a text style widget. Notice how it's just, that's why they call it the widget tree. If you remember from the reading, it's the widget tree because it's one, like the the rightmost widget all the way out here is going to be like, for example, a leaf. Then as you move up, you're going to be moving closer to the trunks. You're going to have branches and a trunk. That's pretty big in computer science and in programming, that concept of a tree. So this text style, we're going to have a font size. This font size, we're going to have the 20 point. Font weight is going to be bold. Again, user tooling, super useful. I know I keep saying the same thing over and over again, and it's because it really helps clean up your code. After that, we're going to want a text field. So since this is a column, this column takes in children, so I can take in multiple widgets that I can display. It's one of those types of visual elements that can display multiple visual elements inside of them. If you think to HTML, think of like a div, or if that's really honestly the best one that I can think of. Or if you're working with like another, like XAML, say for example, if you're working with like WPF or Xamarin, think of like your data template, that's what it is. And then that can take in multiple things, and that's what's going to be iterated through. We're gonna go through visual iterables in the next week or two, so that you can display multiple items on screen and bind it to a list of type T, of any type basically. So we're gonna have our text field here, and this text field is gonna have that controller, like I mentioned. Notice all these nice methods within it, or at least these other parameters. So autocorrect is one you likely saw. So that probably takes in a boolean. So pretty self-explanatory what autocorrect is going to do. But yeah, there's a lot of really nice things with this. Make sure to read the docs. Again, not preaching to the choir, but I'm repeating myself, and it's because it's so big. So our controller, now we ran into the first point where we need to define something. So if we go to the top of the class, top of this here class, notice where this other local is defined. And we're not going to use this actually. So we're going to define a text editing controller. That's going to be final. We're going to call this income controller. And we're going to assign that. We're going to assign to just basically a new text editing controller. Oh, that's beautiful. So since it's not referenced, it's going to give us a message. Make note of these, by the way. These messages, they can be useful in bigger projects. So we're going to attach this to this controller parameter. Now, notice whenever we create a private property, we add this underscore. I guess you don't have to. It's still going to compile, but it's just one of those formatting things. Typically, in mobile applications, if you have a private property or some might refer to it as like a private backing field, it's going to have an underscore first, and then lowercase, and then camel casing. And if it's a public property, it's going to be capital. Not always the case, but typically that holds true. And variable naming is another big one. Make sure you're very explicit with your variable naming. So if you have, say, like a list of int, right? List of int items. So you have this here. I mean, that's not very descriptive, right? What do these items actually represent? So if this list of int, if these items are, say, employee IDs, well, then that's what you should name it, employee IDs. Because that, when you're referring to this later in code, it's clear as to what it is, whereas if it's named like items or ints or anything like that, it's not quite as descriptive. In a small application, not a huge deal, but once you work in a larger project, it really it catches up with you. So make sure to be explicit. The reason a lot of people back in the day would go and have really small abbreviated variable names, or like say they had like an X coordinate where it's X or Y. I guess that might be kind of appropriate, but really short variable names is because those actually took up space in memory. When we're working with a system that has 16 gigabytes of RAM, it's not really a big deal. When it comes to that, actually, the bigger deal that you got to look into is time complexity and making sure that your methods are efficient. Because say you have like a for loop within a for loop, and you're creating stuff within it, or you're accessing stuff, it can take a toll on your RAM. So we're gonna get rid of this because it's just a tangent that I went off on. Let's look at. Let's go back down here. Keyboard type. We're not going to worry about that here for now. And what type of keyboard do we want? Well, we're going to want to have a number there. And if we don't, why don't we skip on this actually for now, just to show it off. Right. One second here, just so I can get this resolved. Just needed to get rid of that const there, so not a big deal. This, however, can have a const. So now that that's set, this can get a little bit annoying. All right, well, notice that it shows up a keyboard, a standard keyboard. This can be kind of annoying if you got to go and enter this stuff in multiple times. It can get a little bit annoying. So instead of doing this, why don't we have that keyboard type defined? And why don't we text input type? Whoops. Dot number. All right, now if we save and we click on here, let's do a hot reload. Or hot restart. Oops. There we go. Now it should show the text keyboard type, so that can be pretty useful. Next, we're gonna want to have a text decoration because we don't know what this does, right? This is just a random input field, or maybe it's not even an input field. Maybe it's just a separator. The user won't know, so or they may or may not know depending on the context. But typically, if you just have random stuff like that scattered throughout the UI, they probably aren't going to know. It's going to be an undesirable application. So we're going to set a decoration, and we're going to have an input decoration. This input decoration is going to take in label text, and we're going to set that to just a string. We don't have to have a text widget inside of this input decoration. It handles all that. So we'll set this to income. Save that. There we go. So now the user knows that it's income. Next, we need to create a row here. And this row is gonna. This is really gonna be. It's gonna get a little bit confusing here, but basically it's just gonna be for formatting. It's gonna help structure this next block. So this is the first block. This is the first block right here, inside of this column. This is the first block of the column. The label and the input field. So now after that we're going to want to have a row. So this row, we're going to want to align it. And notice again the type of alignment that we use here. Okay, then we're going to set our children in here, type widget. We're going to have several items in this here row. It's going to get a little confusing, so we're going to have, again, a row inside of this. And this row is going to have, again, children, type widget. And it's going to have a radio button. So radio button, What's this radio button going to represent? It's going to represent whether or not they're single. So single or married. I know that there may be other states that that are actually used in the tax calculation for the purpose of the application. We're not going to refer to any of that stuff. So this radio button is going to have a value of false, an initial value of false. Oh, sorry. Save to format everything. Add a trailing comma there to kind of clean it up. It wants the const. We're just not going to worry about that for now. Group value. What's this bound to? It's going to be bound to a nullable bool. So we need to define that bool up here. What's that bool going to represent? It's going to represent whether or not they're married. So let's see where we defined text editing controller. Right under that, we're going to define a boolean as married and initialize that to false. So is married. It's good to go. Gotta go back over here. And then what are we going to do with this radio button? Well, we need to listen to the change. So we need to fire off some logic when it changes. So the logic that we're going to fire off is going to be done inside of a set state. But to be able to attach that logic, we need to have an onChanged property. We need to assign that to that to lambda, basically. So onChanged, we're going to have value. We could do arrow notation. We could also do this. See, it's valid syntax either ways, but you can do whatever you want to do to keep it clean. Notice how that const problem kind of went away, and I believe it's based on whether or not it's going to be a visual element that changes through time, or whether it's going to be static. So we have this value that changes, and this value is going to be a nullable bool. So we're going to have a set state fire off in here. So set capital S tab, and it'll set all that other stuff. So what do we want to do inside of the set state? We want to update the value of them being married. So is married is going to be set to value as bool. Why as bool? Because value can come in. I know that it says like it's defined here, but if you don't define it, it won't know. It needs an explicit definition, and the thing too is that it's nullable. That's the bigger thing, actually. So since it's nullable, we need to have a method in place to make it not null. Or we could do this. I apologize for that. So this is another option, the null coalescing operator. So what this does is it says, all right, and you know what, instead of saying what it does, why don't we go through how it would be done without the null coalescing operator. So we would do if value equals null, then we're going to do is married is equal to false. Else is married is equal to whatever, right? You get what I mean? So instead of doing all this logic, we're just going to do is married is equal to value false. What this says is, let's assign to is married the value of value. Not a very good name, right? But the value of value, and if value is null, just set it to false. So let's say that value is true. All right, well then is married is going to be set to true. Let's say that value is false. Well then is married is going to be set to false. What if value is null? What if there's no value, right? Well then we're going to assume that that means false, because we can't handle a non is married, right? So we can't have that. And if we do, that may cause an exception. That may cause the application to break. So we need to ensure that we do null checking if we have the potential to have a null value. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to go as bool. And that's also going to handle the casting. So if we look here, there's our first radio. Looks pretty good so far, but what is this radio, right? What does this represent? Well, we're going to want to have a text widget to kind of demonstrate what this represents. So right after that, here's our radio. We're going to go ahead and do const text single. Set that. Cool. There it is. Whether they're single or they're married. After that, and again, it might be, it doesn't look super clean, but this is the way that I formatted it. Just wrote it up real quick, so it'll start coming together here. We're going to set our children to a widget. And we're going to have a radio inside of here. And you're going to notice that a lot of the logic is the same. So instead of doing all this stuff over and over again, we're just going to copy. We've got to make sure that we select all the stuff that we need to select. Don't grab it. That's a pretty big way. That's a pretty easy way to run into problems where you have your trailing commas and then it doesn't compile, or you don't have enough trailing commas. So we're going to get rid of this here. We're going to paste that in. But the problem is that, actually here we're going to want to copy this as well. So after this radio, set this to married. But notice this problem here. They're both set. So what do we do here? Well, we need to set the logic. We need to have this logic, and we need to write the logic here. But we also need to do initialization stuff. I'm sorry if I said logic. The logic's actually being done in the set state. We need to initialize this to true. And there we go. As you update them, it's going to be like a flip-flop, right? If one's true, then the other one has to be false. If the other one's false, it has to be true because of the type, because it's a bool. So now that that's done, we're going to, let me get my trailing commas cleaned up here. So, all right, we're still in our column here. I just gotta see where I am here, I'm sorry. Okay, so after this row, we're gonna have some padding. We're gonna set our values here. It's gonna be all over, 5 pixels. This padding is gonna take in a child, only one. And in here, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a row. Set our children, type widget. And inside of here, we're going to have our state. So what the state is, we're going to create another variable up here, and that variable is going to contain the states that we can choose. For now, we're just going to worry about drawing this stuff on the screen. So we set our children here. First, we're going to want to have some text. So text is going to be state. Save that. There we go. There's our state label. Now that we have that, we're going to want a sized box. This is going to be to clean up the UI and to make it up here. Instead of having it be all the way like the width of the screen, it'll be a lot cleaner. It'll be of width 20. So the sized box, we're going to have our width size 20. And then we're going to have our drop down button. Our items. But actually we're not going to worry about that for now. First the on changed. On changed. We're gonna have it be. We're gonna set it to a string, a nullable string. New value is gonna be the name of the variable. Then we need to go and write the logic here for the on changed. set the state. Whoops. So notice how I did a semicolon here. That's something that, so you can do that, I guess, wherever. So say you have a set state somewhere. Let's find a good example here. If true, then, well, then what? Well, then semicolon, because we're going to add some logic in there later. That's something that you can do. Could be kind of useful. So our drop down button, we have our set state in here. And what's the state going to do? Well, now we need to start worrying about the state. And we needed to do that before, actually, with our value. So what's the value going to be here? What's going to be our states? So we need to go and we need to create our list of type string. Notice again, nullable string. I'm doing it kind of backwards here. Typically you'd go and create your list of what you're going to bind it to, and then you're going to go and create your visual element. In this case, I'm just demonstrating the general concept of how that structure works. So we're going to have a list of type string, and this is going to be a list of states, and we're going to initialize it with, or not initialize, we're going to fill it with Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and South Dakota. But now with the whole initialization thing that I mentioned earlier, that's pretty important. We need to have a first state. So I'll just set that to Minnesota. There we go. Something else you could do is you could set the selected state to the first element of the states list. I'm just setting it to Minnesota. Honestly, though, setting it to the first element of the states list would be preferable, though. That way, if it changes, if the state name changes, which I don't foresee Minnesota changing from MN to something else in the future, but again, it might not be states, it might be customer IDs, it might be if they're an employer or not. So keep that in mind. So now that we have our list of states, we need to, let me get back to the logic over here. So we're going to set that to selected state. So that's what's going to be set right away. But then we also need our items, what it's going to be grabbing from, what's going to be loaded in that list, the visual list. So items, that's going to be set to, and it's going to be, it might get a little bit confusing here, but bear with me. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go states.map, and we need to map it to something that this will be able to use. So we're going to set it to be a map of type drop down menu item. And that menu item is going to be of type string. And then we need to set a string value. And in here we need to return a drop-down menu item of type string. Whoops. The value is going to be the value that we referenced up here. And actually, instead of doing that one, I just set it to menu item. The child, it's going to be a text widget with menu item inside of it. Whoops. And let me clean this up real quick, just because looks like there might be a syntax problem here. Okay, so I had a small problem here. I restructured how I had where I had the on change just for readability. So we need to convert this to a list. And now that that's done, might be missing a trailing. Yeah, there we go. So that's clean. We're gonna wait. And there we go. We can set our state. However, that's kind of funny that I said we can set our state, because that's exactly what we need to do. That's why selecting our state isn't working, because we don't set the state. We don't update the value. So what we need to do in the set state is we need to check if our new value is not equal to null. Then we can do selected state is equal to new value. Save that. This should update now. There we go. Excellent. So we have our state. What do we need now? We need our submit button. So they enter their income. Let's say 100K. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What is that? Yeah, looks good. They need to set their income. They need to select whether or not they're single, and they need to select their state, the state that they reside in. So now that that's done, they need to submit this data. So to submit it, we're going to just create an elevated button. If we look back up the widget tree, the center here, the child to center is the padding. So what we're going to do is, let me just make sure that I'm saying this correctly. Okay. So actually we don't want to do it there. We want to, I was in the wrong padding. And I think this needs to be set to const. There we go. This padding. See, the reason I questioned myself is because I looked up here and I wanted to add a button after this. But if we look here, this first padding is the child of center. So if we try to add something after padding, that's going to be impossible, because padding is the only child. We can't add a second child because center doesn't support multiple items. So it's actually this here padding, because notice how it's inside of that widget array, or that list of widgets. So here we're going to want the elevated button, and this elevated button is going to have a method on this method that we're going to attach to onPressed. We could do the logic in line for readability. I won't. I'll be doing the logic up here. I'll actually define a method to run the logic. So for the child, we're going to have a text widget, and that text widget is going to say submit. Add a few trailing commas here, save that, and it's not going to compile because our onPressed is set. A little trick though, if you want to just quickly drop a UI, is you can set this to null. And there we go. It's not going to be selectable, but it will be on the screen and it will compile. So we need to go and create our method. So we're going to move up to the top after our variable definition section, and we're going to go ahead and say we're going to create a void method. It's not going to return anything. I'm going to call it handle submit, because that's exactly what it does. And what this method's going to do, that's perfect. I saved and it automatically formatted. Inside of there, we're going to do a set state. And inside of the set state, we're going to want to, sorry, everyone. I'm going to pause and I'm going to disable all my notifications. Sorry about that. Again, I apologize for that. So now let's get back to where we were. This handle submit method needs to go and do some logic here. Obviously, right? Just some filler conversation to keep some audio in the video, huh? So we need an income, and this income is going to be it's going to be grabbed from the text editing controller, the income controller in this case. So just to keep things tidy, we're going to group it right next to it. So income is equal, not income, sorry, double income going to be equal to 0.0. And this income needs to be assigned the value that's inside of that text editing controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a double.tryParse. Why are we going to do that? Well, if we try to do text editing controller, in this case, so I called it by type, but the variable name income controller dot text, well, that's a type mismatch. That's not correct. See, it says right there, value of string cannot be assigned to variable type of double. Very self-explanatory, so we need to cast it. Or parse it, might be the better term there. So we can do a double, and we can do a parse, or we can do a try parse. And I prefer the try parse because that way, if it's null, it doesn't go and throw an exception. So we're going to do income controller dot text. And what are we going to do if the value is null? Well, we're going to set it to 0. Pretty good. This null coalescing operator is quite useful inside of just about every programming language. I love using it because it saves you a couple lines of code. So let's do a little bit of input validation because we don't want our application to break due to bad input. So if the income is less than 1, we're going to notify the user that their income that's not valid, basically. So why don't we do snack bar? We need to define it. We're going to give the snack bar widget a little bit of content. That content's just going to be a text widget to be displayed. And in there, we're just going to say amount must be greater than 0. If I do ever have any spelling mistakes, I do apologize, everyone. There we go. So it's still not going to show up. And why is that? It's because we haven't attached it. So we need to attach our handle submit to this. There we go. So there's no logic to handle having a good value in there. So what we need to do is we could also throw in some junk data. So ASDF, right? Because I can enter the values through my computer. Through the mobile device, you can't really do that, but through the computer, yeah, you can. So let's try passing this junk data, and let's set a breakpoint in here and see what it does. So we submit. All right, what's the value of text editing controller.text? It's 10,000 ASDF. So we're going to step over that. It's going through its logic there. The value is 0.0 because the try parse failed. Failed to parse, so it went to the, and I believe it assigns it to null, so we just went and grabbed the value of 0. So if the income is less than 1, we need to display that. So let's see why. All right. So, okay, I see the problem now. So it's not showing, and why is that? It's because we don't tell it to show the message. So what we need to do inside of here, so we need to get outside of the snack bar, and then we need to do scaffold messenger .of, and then we're going to pass in the context of the entire page. Notice where context is set. It's that build context, and that's used globally through this page. And then we're going to call the method show snack bar. And that snack bar is going to be the one that we defined, which it's perfect because the default value is that. Save, submit, get rid of this breakpoint. There we go. Amount must be greater than 0. So that looks pretty good. Now, what happens if we pass in a good, what happens if we pass in a good value? So 10 or 100,000. Well, we don't have any logic for that, so why don't we add that logic? So if the income's less than 1, do this stuff. Else, we need to do some other stuff. So here's where we need to go and head over to create our class. We could do the logic in line. So we could have all that conditional stuff, but instead of doing that, we may use this logic outside of the app, or maybe not outside of the app, but outside of this here page. So ideally, you would go and create a class. In that class would have that logic that you're going to run. Compartmentalization is a very big concept. So where you can take compartmentalization and granularization, where you can take stuff you can take big blocks of logic and then convert them into smaller, more manageable chunks of logic. So after this class, because think about this, this is all one big class. Right here, the name of the class is my homepage state. So after this big class, we need to create a new class. And this class is going to be tax model. This tax model is going to have a couple items. So it's going to have a state. It's going to have a double income. And it's going to have a Boolean is married. Notice how that coincides with some of the values that we had previously in the application. So we're going to create the constructor here. Alright, it's not liking something here. Huh. You guys probably were all screaming, hey, you did not use curly braces. Yeah. Apologize for that. So what this constructor does, you all should know this by now, is if you go and initialize, instantiate a new tax model object, the first parameter that you pass in has to be the state, second parameter has to be the income, the third parameter has to be the is married value. So that's just the constructor there. Now we're going to have a method calculate taxes. And it's going to return double. This method calculate taxes is going to have a couple local variables. So a double state tax rate. So there's this, I just tried a little shortcut that I use in Visual Studio 2022. And if you do Control D, you click on something, you hit Control D, it duplicates it on the next slide. It doesn't seem to do that here. Might have to update my bindings. So we're going to have our state tax rate, our federal tax rate, our state tax liability, and our federal tax liability. So first we need to have a check in place to see if they're married or not. So if they're married, real quick, I'm going to cover this now before it becomes a problem. If you are working inside of a class and if you're questioning whether or not to use the this keyword, because this is totally valid, this works fine, but it's unnecessary. It ends up making the code look amateur, I guess might be the correct word. You want to get rid of the warnings if you can, because those warnings can turn into errors later on in the future. Basically, you're going to use the this keyword when you might have potential ambiguity. So in this case, there is two is marrieds. So which is married are we referencing? Are we referencing the local one, the one that's local to method calculate taxes, or are we referencing the one that's local to the entire class? Well, we're referencing the one that's open to the entire class. If we do this here, that might... Oh, we need to assign something to it. So, but notice that though, it's going to give you that assignment problem. So it's referencing this one right here. So, oops. That's where that might be useful. Since we don't have that potential ambiguity, we can just use the variable name. We don't have to say this dot. If you're working in like Angular or any other TypeScript or JavaScript environment, the this keyword might be necessary for almost everything. Even though there might not be ambiguity, it might still be necessary for everything. But we're not working in Angular, and we're not working in that other, JavaScript or whatever where it might be relevant. So it's not really. We're going to stick with what's valid for this language, this framework. So if they're married, we're going to check to see if their income falls within a bracket. So if the income is less than or equal to 20,000, then federal tax rate is equal to 0.1, 10%. To avoid writing all this stuff, because this is going to get kind of tedious, I'm just going to copy it and paste it over here. I'll leave this on screen so you can pause and copy if you need to. Right, now that that's good, we're going to handle the else. What happens if they're not married? So we're going to have basically the exact same logic, but with different brackets, different values. So I'll write out the first one again. If the income is less than 10,000, less than or equal to 10,000, then federal tax rate is equal to 10%. Copy and paste the logic over here. Excellent. Next, now that we have this here logic done, we still want to stay in the scope of the method. So keep an eye on our curly braces here. We're going to move to this one here. And we're going to switch to the states. So through these states. Whatever state is assigned inside of this class. Now, something we could do, in retrospect, now that I've already written the application, is we could have the this list of states outside of this class where it'd be accessible by all classes. And actually, that wouldn't be a very good idea, honestly. The way that this is structured, we could have this in another class where we have like global definitions of states. So like a class that has all the states, and then we go and create an instance of that class. It could be a static instance because this is a single user application. It's not going to be used. There's no chance that states is going to be referenced multiple times. Whereas if you're working inside of an API, a public-facing API, if you have a method that's getting bombarded with calls, so like a method login, and if login references a static variable outside of that class, or something that's static within the scope of the entire program, well, what might end up happening is if one user makes a call to that, and then they go and update the value of that static variable, and then another user at the exact same time goes and does the exact same thing and updates the value, they might run into an issue where one user's info shows up in the other user's response, basically. So they go and make a request at the exact same time, the logic goes and fires off, and say the user passes in a social security number, and for some terrible design decision, this social security number is in a class that gets in a static class, and then you go and return their social security number in the payload. Well, if two of them made the call at the exact same time, you may end up crossing up those social security numbers. Of course, that's probably not going to happen, right? Why would you go and have a social security number exposed? But it could be anything, right? It could be logging data, so like some of the device info. So two of them make a call at the exact same time. One of them is an Android, one of them's iOS, and you crisscross that data. Well, now you're saying, hey, this error happened on iOS when it actually happened on Android. Hope you're still following. I know that can get a little bit complex, but the long story short here is we could have this accessible to the entire class and have it be static. That way we're not creating new instances each time. We're just referencing a global class that contains states, and we can use that everywhere. That way, instead of having to update states, instead of having to create a list of states inside of, say, 3 different files, and having to update all of those whenever we want to go and make a change, or say Puerto Rico gets added as a state to the United States, well, all we have to do is we just got to go and add it to the global file, rather than updating every single instance. That's the value, right? If you're in a solo environment and you're working in an application that has 1,000 lines of code, yeah, it's not really going to be that important. But if you're working into an application that has dozens of projects, not that the amount of lines of code is representative of how complex an application is, but I mean, think about it: 1 million, 10 million lines of code. that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of logic that's being executed. So really helps for that. But back to this, after now that my little tangent is over. Let me see how much time we have here. All right, hour and 4 minutes, looking good. We pass in the state, and we go and make the bad design decision to use states that we define explicitly each time. So we're going to switch the state, which remember is local to this class, and we need to handle the case, right? So case Minnesota. What are we going to do in here? We're going to use some Python syntax. Basically, it's pretty interesting how it does that. And we're going to set our state tax rate to 0.6875. I'm sorry. There you go. I'm gonna pause here, hearing my dogs bark outside. Sorry about that. So we have our case for Minnesota. Now that we set it, we need to break out of this. Next, we need to have our case for Wisconsin. State tax rate is equal to, let's just say 0.05, so 5%. Okay, so why might this be problematic? Just real quick to cover this. The problem is that say that you misspell one of these, and have it set to WI like that. That's not the same. So WI with lowercase is not the same as WI with an uppercase. So it's not going to be mapped properly. So it's not going to hit any of this logic. If you have a default, it's going to go to that default. So that might be a bug that you could run into, and you don't want to be chasing bugs. You just want good, clean logic, right? That's what you would want. So I'll go ahead and copy these other ones just for keep up on time here. So now we set our state tax. What do we want to do next? We want to do the actual calculation. So federal tax liability is equal to the income multiplied by the tax rate. So let's say that we have $10,000, and we multiply this by 0.32. $3,200 should be the expected liability. So it's a good idea to, if you have to do any sort of logic like that, to have a calculator nearby, just so you can verify that everything gets done right. If you're subtracting stuff, make sure you have your stuff organized in the right manner so you don't end up with a negative. State tax liability, we're going to assign income multiplied by the state tax rate. And what are we going to do now? Well, we have our values now. We just need to return them. So we're going to return the sum of federal tax liability and state tax liability. Good to go. So now that we have our class created, we need to display our results. I did not like that. I'd like to get rid of that. Yeah, whatever. We'll leave it. So, if they do have a valid income, we need to go and create a new instance of the tax model. So, tax model is equal to the constructor. So we're going to pass in the selected state, we're going to pass in the income, and we're going to pass in whether or not they're married. Perfect. And if we look here, It actually gives you the constructor, which is pretty nice. Next, we want to have a variable to store the amount. We could reference the calculate taxes method of tax model and just have that passed directly into the item that we want to display, the snack bar. But in this case, just for readability, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to create a variable to contain that. And this is going to work fine. However, the problem, as you're going to see in a little bit, is that it's going to have a bunch of decimal places, and we don't want that because money isn't, 10.1100 whatever percent, or not percent, I'm sorry, it's not $10.1115, right? It's going to be 2 decimal places. So we want to make sure that we display that properly. We're going to create a new snack bar here. We're going to have a text widget to display the amount of taxes due. And we're going to do some string interpolation. So we're going to display the amount. Once that gets calculated, of course, nothing's going to be printed to the screen because we don't have this method that displays it on screen. So actually, we can just steal this here code and paste it down here. So why don't we try that? Cool. They owe, if they make $100,000, they owe quote unquote $29,000. Not correct, but for the intent of this, that's what they would owe. And honestly, that doesn't sound 100% correct, but we can go and debug through this. So now that we do that, let's see, we need to go and store that value as a fixed string. So we're going to do toString as fixed, 2 decimal places. Notice how it says right here, gives you all that nice documentation. So 1.toString as fixed with 3 decimal places is going to be 1.000. Really useful method here. Save that. Let's try calculating the taxes again. Perfect. And I mean, if we really want to get technical, we could do this. Let's see here. There we go. I believe that's the right symbol. There we go. So this is just the escape, because without the escape we're going to run into a little problem like that. So little detail, you need to escape anything that might be used for interpolation. So taxes due $29,000. I was going to have the commas. I was going to have logic in here to display the commas, but that would require an additional class to be referenced. We'd have to import a new package. I didn't want to import that package. I just wanted it to be standalone. So I looked into making my own implementation using a regular expression, and it's doable. It's just, so far we've covered a lot of stuff. I think it might be a little bit too much to cover regular expressions in this lecture. So for that purpose, I'm just going to keep it like this. So let's see what's actually being done here. We passed in $100,000. Let's try to see if they're married. $27,000 is what they would owe. Let's see what's going on here. So we go and go under calculate taxes method. Let's just go here first actually. We're going to hit this. Are they married? Yes. So since they are married, we're going to go through this little block of logic. Income's not less than $20,000, so we're not going to hit, whoops, all right, continue. The income is not less than $20,000. It's not within that range either. But it is within this range, so the tax rate's going to be 22%. That gets stored. Kind of just talking to myself here, honestly, but state, Wisconsin. It's not Minnesota, it is Wisconsin, so we're going to assign that to our state tax rate. Federal tax rate of 22% multiplied by the income of $100,000. It's going to leave us with a federal tax liability of $22,000. Which is good. And then our state tax liability $5,000, so 27,000. Yeah, that all looks good. What about, oh, whoops. What about $1 million? Nope, you're gonna have to pay that much. So in this case, they wouldn't be, the more you earn, any penny that you earn above $207,000 if you're single, or $414,000 if you're married, is gonna be taxed at 32%. So no comment on that. Let's, so all this logic looks pretty good so far. Whoops, what did I put here? $1,000, pay $150. Let's try testing the functionality of different states. That is the same as that one. Okay, so there's a default time on the snack bar, like how long that snack bar is going to be displayed for. I don't modify that here. We could have it set to, say, 1,000 milliseconds. That's only 1 second, or whatever you want it to be. Let's see, duration. What does this actually take? It's a real question. The default is 4 seconds. And I don't actually know what it takes. I don't use the snack bar and Flutter much, but yeah. I want to pause and actually figure out exactly what it is so that you guys can know what the how to set the duration. So that's done just by the duration widget. If we hover over that, it has it can take in multiple things. So you can set seconds, minutes, hours, and this can be used for a lot of things. It can be used for like a loading thing. It can be used for an API call timeout. This is actually quite useful though if you have ever worked with like C++ or C#, because this is a really compact way of handling durations. So why don't we try submitting that? Save. 1 second. There we go. Milliseconds to 500 instead. Cool. There we go. So there's that value. Change it to Iowa. $1,600. South Dakota, $1,450. Minnesota, $1,687. So that all looks good so far. But yeah, in general, that's the gist of this application. So just as a recap, we covered lists and how we can use them inside of our code. Covered selected index. In this case, it'd be the state, and how we could bind that to, in this case, a into a drop-down button. So we can have our list of states. We covered a little bit more of state and how we can update the state, and a little bit of casting stuff and parsing. A little bit of object-oriented programming. A little bit of stuff with padding. And we learned a little bit about taxes. Some of you may have, some of you may have not. Some of you might have already known of this stuff. So that's the gist of it. It's pretty straightforward. Reach out to me if you have any questions, but that's about it. Thanks for watching.